So, is there life after philosophy? I'm interviewing philosophy majors years after graduation. Let's hear what they have to say. I'm Christopher Anadale. Welcome to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Edgar Beltrán, who is Rome correspondent for The Pillar, a US-based Catholic news site. He completed his bachelor's degree in philosophy in 2020 at the Universidad Católica Cecilio Acosta in Maracaibo, Venezuela. He then did a research master's in philosophy of mind and science at Radboud University in the Netherlands. In 2024, he graduated cum laude with a thesis on Aquinas and the philosophy of neuroscience. He has taught courses in medieval philosophy, natural theology, and the thought of Soren Kierkegaard at the St. Thomas Aquinas Major Seminary in Maracaibo. He speaks Spanish, English, Italian, Portuguese, and a bit of Dutch. He currently lives in Rome with his wife and two small children. Edgar, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And the Spanish was on point. The Spanish was very good, the pronunciation.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear it. I'm always worried about sounding a fool.
No, it's perfect. It's fine.
Okay. Well, I'd love to talk with you about your work in Rome, about your work for The Pillar, about your perspective on philosophy from where you're at right now. But I thought I would begin with the thing that prompted me to approach you, since you're not a former student of mine and we've not met before this. And this was a tweet you sent out, or a post on X, about a month ago on May 14th, where you wrote, if you don't mind my quoting it, "I will always be grateful for the advice my mom gave me. Study what you want, but learn a trade. I studied philosophy, but worked as a translator for many years before journalism gave me enough money to sustain my family. But I still mostly see myself as a philosopher." And I read that several weeks ago, and I said, well, this is somebody I need to contact, because that's just what this podcast is about how people look back on their philosophy education. Maybe we could begin from that. Could you elaborate any on that? How do you still think of yourself, even as having been a translator and now a journalist, as still
Yeah.
being a philosopher as well?
Yeah, the thing is, I studied philosophy out of sheer passion, Like I was already working when I started studying philosophy because I had studied political science previously. And I was already working, as a copywriter, worked in social media, translator, and also some, so yeah, in these areas mostly. I also worked at a school as a religion teacher. So, but then after graduating from political science, I started working, had some spare time, and actually at the end of my political science studies, I was like, this is not what I want to do my whole life. I don't want to be like an advisor, political advisor for 34 years, and especially not in Venezuela. If I'm going to be a martyr, it's for the Catholic Church, not for politics. So. I'm not. I feel like this is not what I want to do. But I was nearly in the end, so I was like, I'm gonna finish my studies anyways. But then I was like, and then I actually, even though I'm working as a translator, stuff like this, it's not like I wanted to study languages or translation or marketing because I was working in marketing. So I was like, I'm gonna study what actually like, what I actually want, which is philosophy, even though I don't really make a career out of it or anything. So then I started studying philosophy in this small Catholic University in my city. Graduated in 3 years or so, and then actually it's very funny. I mean, then I started working as a philosopher because I started teaching in the local Catholic seminary. And then it's very funny because I studied philosophy simply because I liked it, simply because I wanted to. But then actually I got a scholarship in the Netherlands to study philosophy abroad. So it actually became useful for my family. So I got married at the end of my studies. So I defended my thesis maybe a couple of months before I got married. My wife got pregnant right away, and then because of COVID, my graduation ceremony was actually after my first son was born. He was a couple of months old during when my graduation ceremony happened. So yeah, I then moved to the Netherlands to continue pursuing my philosophical studies, and then when I was confronted with the reality of I mean I thought I wanted to be a philosophy lecturer, or perhaps a sort of public intellectual. So I wanted to use my philosophy, but on the more public arena. But I was inching towards academia. But then moving to the Netherlands, seeing it from the inside, and also seeing how it would affect my family, because then I was living in a town called Nijmegen. I would probably have to move to a different city to do my PhD, whether in the Netherlands or even abroad. Then probably the same for a postdoc, and then probably the same wherever I found a job, and I didn't want to submit my family to that, to have. I mean, it could be the case. I could be lucky and do everything in Nijmegen, and we've been very happy because we're very happy in the town. But the usual thing is that you move around a lot until you find a job, and I didn't want to submit my family to that. So and then the stars aligned. I was already writing for the Pillar, but most as a freelance. And I got this job in Rome, and then I was like, okay, then we go to journalism, which was one of my first passions as a kid. I wanted to be a baseball broadcaster. I wanted to be like Vince Scully or Ernesto Jerez, which is like the equivalent of Vince Scully in the Spanish-speaking world. But then journalism was actually my first passion as a kid. So then I went through to journalism, and I think one of the reasons why is precisely, or why do I still see myself as a philosopher? First, because it's my great passion. It's what I love the most, and I love to teach. I love to teach in the seminary, and especially because I taught Augustine and Aquinas mostly, so and the Church Fathers. So that was a great passion for me. And second, because I think that when you study philosophy and you study well, it gives you a frame of mind and a way of analyzing problems and approaching problems that simply sticks with you, which is one of the first basic movements a philosopher does is taking a step back. Now, the philosopher sees a problem, sees an issue, whether it's a social issue, it's a metaphysical problem, a logical problem, whatever, an ethical dilemma, and you take a step back. You try to see the source of the problem, the roots of the issue, um, and and this is a way of thinking that's still there with me, and. And the second way I would say I still see myself as a philosopher. Philosophy comes from love of wisdom in Greek. Um, and wisdom has a very deep relationship with truth. And I think journalism is an apostolate of truth. If you understand journalism correctly, you're seeking to uncover the truth about things. In this case, about the church. About mostly the human aspects of the church. So then I see a very deep relationship between a good journalist and a good philosopher, because there are a lot of bad journalists too. But a good journalist seeks the truth, and seeks to uncover the deepest truth as possible, which is in a way the same thing a philosopher does. Of course, a philosopher does thinking, reflecting on issues, whereas a journalist does it researching on the field, talking with people, etc. But the goal deep inside is the same, which is to discover truth and in a way also to contemplate truth. Yeah.
That's an excellent insight. And I was actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking I should ask you about what you mean by journalism, since it might often be accused of being kind of superficial or being concerned with the events of the day, but not anything that goes beyond the day. But it sounds like your approach to researching, uncovering, and publishing the truth is more philosophical in the sense that you just outlined. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would agree with you. I actually believe that journalism is a pretty bad place today. In certain parts of the world because of persecution and censorship, in other parts of the world because of manipulation, fake news, etc. So it's because with perverted journalism, and in certain parts of the world, uh, journalism is not allowed to be a service to truth, and in other parts, journalists don't want to serve truth. They want to serve themselves or their masters or whomever. So there's always this temptation of because as a journalist you want to be the news in a way. You also want to be the news. You also want to be famous. So it's a big temptation to try to take the highway instead of the stairs. And it's to simply lie or manipulate or make the big headline or publish something, not necessarily that it's false, but that you're not certain it's true. Something you don't have perhaps the necessary truth, the necessary certainty to publish. So yeah, I think we perhaps need to take a step back and see what are we doing in journalism. And I think a major issue of this is that journalists don't have many journalists. I'm not going to generalize. Many journalists don't have a strong intellectual background because like a politician in Venezuela, or a very solid politician in the 60s, which was the time Venezuela became a democracy again, said the journalists, many journalists were a notion of knowledge with an inch of depth, which is a little bit about many things, but you don't really have like intellectual depth, and you don't have and you don't understand journalism as this service to truth, and as this, as you usually call the fourth power, which is like it's this way of calling out power, but then also not with every weapon that you can use, but with truth, because as power corrupts, people in power can lie often, but then not simply you want to uncover them not because you have personal vendetta, but because you're in a service of truth, and because you're in a service of truth, and we Catholics believe that there's a very deep relationship between truth, good, and beauty, and then also with charity. Then journalism is also a service to charity. So you deserve, your opponents or the people you're writing about also deserve charity. And I think this is something that's very much forgotten these days in journalism. Yeah.
No, that's excellent. I agree with you completely. I was thinking also for the Catholic journalist, there's this added layer of tension in dealing, especially I suppose in Rome, as you're as a Rome correspondent, with the Catholic hierarchy, and without dredging up any controversies or getting into anything, getting deep into the weeds. There's this demand for truth, this need for truth, right? And I think that proceeds not just from a sort of religious devotion, but also from just a natural philosophical love of
Yeah.
truth, love of beauty, love of the good. That it's always seemed to me to be very philosophical in its character. That is, the insufficient sort of love of truth and hatred of error and lies seems to me to have a kind of philosophical component to it. Of course, there's also the church's commitment to transparency and the challenges of the Pillar as a lay media organization, and I say one that I've admired a great deal the past 4 or 5 years since they were founded in 2021, as being really committed to bringing out stories and telling them truly and fairly. Um, I suppose I introduced that whole idea there, but I don't know that I want to ask a specific question about it. I'd actually like to shift into asking you about life in Rome, especially reporting from Rome during the recent conclave. That's
Yeah.
maybe a only 3 or 4 times in a lifetime event to
Yeah.
see the election of a
Yeah.
pope, perhaps. What was that like for you in particular as a new resident of Rome, and then also as somebody who's reporting? How did that work out for you?
Well, as you said, like 3 or 4 times in a lifetime. Like in Italy, they have a saying which is "ogni morte papa," which is every death of a pope, and it signifies something that happens only not very often. Ogni morte papa. So I actually arrived in Rome almost exactly a month before Pope Francis died. So I had been working as the Vatican correspondent of the Pillar since June 2024, but I was finishing my master's in the Netherlands, and then the visas took a while to be able to move here because we're not European citizens. So we still needed visas to move to Italy to be able to work here, and that took quite some time, things often do with Italian bureaucracy. But then finally we were able to move in March, and we were here. We actually arrived on St. Joseph's Day, so March 19th. So that's why I say almost exactly a month before Pope Francis died, because Pope Francis died on April 20th. So yeah, I was pretty much new in town, I gotta say that the week the Pope died, the week before, we actually finished unpacking, like we actually finished unloading all of our things, and we finally like felt at home. And I was like, okay, finally, Holy Week also went by, which is a very chaotic week in Rome. And we were like, okay, now we can start doing our life and all that. But yeah, and then Pope Francis died. So then it became like the most chaotic month of my life. So it was quite an experience, I mean, I regret a little bit that I was a bit of a newcomer. So I didn't still, I mean, I know some people here, but if it would have happened maybe a year after I moved here, I would have been more comfortable in the city, comfortable with my Italian, like now that it's just a couple of months, 3 months after we arrived now, I'm quite comfortable with my Italian, it's not great, but it's conversational. At that point, was still not that comfortable with it. So it's always a bit difficult to talk with people, etc., and so yeah, but then that's like the downside. I felt like a bit of a newcomer. Now the upside, first of all, I mean, as a journalist, you always are a bit cynical about things, Even though I'm a Catholic, so yeah, I believe that the Holy Spirit is working somehow in the conclave and all that. I was like, yeah, but the cardinals are the cardinals, But then I actually noticed that they most of them, I would say, the impression that they gave me, even many cardinals I didn't agree with, is that they take their job very seriously. So I think they feel the weight of the responsibility, and the weight looking at God in the eyes and making this decision. So even though they might have, some of them might have preferences that I don't agree with, I would say now that I think I don't know if most cardinals, but at least a good number of cardinals take their jobs very seriously. At least this job specifically of choosing the new pope. And when I say they take it seriously, it's not that they simply analyze the things, but that they do see the supernatural in it. That they do pray about it. That they see it as an spiritual experience, and not just as a human opportunity to find a position for themselves or a cushy Vatican job or a bigger diocese or whatever, but that they actually see it as a service to the church, and that they really seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit here. So that's the first thing actually that I notice. The second, and perhaps the most interesting, is still how relevant the Catholic Church is. Like I can think of an event that makes the world stop, like the death of a poet in a conclave, maybe a soccer World Cup, not even the death of the king or a queen of England, not even the inauguration of a US president, I don't know, maybe if a US president died in office, maybe it would reach that level, but I kind of think of many things that would make the world stop and look at a single place for so many days as the death of a pope and a conclave. And I really noticed it just by the sheer number of people from non-Catholic countries, journalists that were working those days in the Vatican and reporting. And they were not simply doing like small bits of coverage, 5 minutes a day or something. They were working all day long, so writing and presenting shorts, talking with cardinals, etc. I saw people from all over. I saw a lot of journalists from the Netherlands. Would expect some Dutch journalists to come, but not as many as they came. Being the Netherlands such a secularized country, journalists from Denmark, a lot of journalists from India, from very very places that you wouldn't expect to pay so much attention to the to the death of a pope and the election of another pope. So that was quite a thing, and I think that the church still has a lot of moral power and a lot of moral weight in this world, and I don't know if we're aware of that as much as we should. Like the church is still a very essential institution in the West. And I think the death of Pope Francis and the election of Pope Leo really show that, like the church still carries a lot of weight in the West. Yeah.
Yeah, that matches my observations as well. We sort of saw that play out in real time, and of course, I think to most of us, very surprising election of Pope Leo. Is there anything you can share about the sort of general feel in Rome about Pope Leo and the coming papacy? Everybody's sort of curious. We want to know more. We'd really like to fast forward through the next 6 months to see what sorts of decisions he makes, what sort of announcements and proclamations he makes. But he's only been Pope for a little over a month when we're speaking right now. What's your feeling about it, or what's your description of the sort of general feeling on the ground in Rome?
Yeah, interestingly, like I arrived in the piazza right when the white smoke came out, so right on time. I remember when the name was said, announced, people were like, "Oh, who's that?" So I could tell they were not pillar readers, because if they were pillar readers, they would know that Cardinal Prevost was among the main papabili, But
I,
people
I,
were
I
like, "Yeah, no, no, go ahead."
no, I remember when they said Roberto, and I said, "Ah, it's Prevost. That's the only
Yeah.
only Roberto among the
Yeah,
main candidates. Yeah.
yeah. So so a lot of people was like, "Who's that?" I mean, what? When they said Leone, Leo the 14th, people were like, "Oh yeah, viva el Papa," etc. But people didn't really know him, even though at least Win the Pillar had reported that he was one of the leading candidates, So it was a bit of surprise, of course. And then I would say that in this first month, there are, I think, I mean, how to define it, like I would say there are two main things. One is a certain continuity with Francis. I wouldn't say a full continuity with Francis, but it's certainly not a rupture. It's not 180 degrees turn. There's a certain continuity, but then also a return of a certain of normalcy. Francis, let's say that Francis opened a lot of doors in the Vatican. The curial reform, the financial reform, abuse crisis, synodality, um, um, also the many controversies with regards to the female diaconate. Of course, he always says he was against that, but then he always opened the door for more discussion. Or the discussions around fiducia supplicans, the problems with the traditionalist, with the TLM, and traditiones custodes, etc. So he opened a lot of doors. Some I think were necessary, some not so much. But then he didn't seem to bring to conclusion many of these issues. So of course there's a big issue there. And then what I would say is that Leo, it's building up on top of what Francis did in this with many of these issues, but then bringing a sense of institutional normalcy to these reforms. And then with others, we'll see what he's going to do. But I think especially with the Curia, with the financial reform, with abuse, he's going to build on top of what Francis did, but with a bit more organization. It seemed like with Francis, everything was a bit chaotic. So yeah, and I would say the other thing, precisely part of the sense of normalcy, which is also a normalcy in forms. You have a pope that wears the mozzera, that sings, that chants the Regina Coeli in Latin, and then that it's also increasingly seems a bit more Christocentric and unapologetic in the way he talks about the Christian faith. I wouldn't try to read too much into this because it's just 1 month, and then Pope Francis also had a lot of beautifully Christocentric homilies, and perhaps there's a certain change in forms which is noticeable, and we can really see something into that. But then I wouldn't try to read too much into seeing like this return of like the more traditional view of the papacy or anything. But it's certainly a certain aesthetic change that I think we should keep an eye on. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time, of course. If the election only comes a few times in a lifetime, of course, the first 6 months, the first year of a new papacy only comes just as often or just as seldom. So
Exactly.
looking forward to hearing more. But everybody seems to feel very good about Pope Leo. There's a lot of love and affection for him in the circles that I'm aware of. So we're waiting to see more.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, if I may, about the daily life of a journalist, because I realized, apart from the title Rome correspondent, I don't have a clear sense of what a journalist does with his time during the day. I have this sort of
Yeah.
image from old black and white movies of, a guy walking around with a notebook and wearing out his shoes, asking people questions. But I presume you do a certain amount of research, a certain amount of interviewing, of
Yeah.
talking with sources who may or may not know something or be able to help you with a story. Are you developing stories sort of over the course of several weeks, or are you pursuing stories on a more short-term basis? What's it like actually doing the work of journalism
Yeah,
in
there's
2025?
there's a little bit of both, and of everything. But first, before I'm a journalist, I'm a father. I'm a Catholic, so I have a very normal life. At the beginning of the day, I just wake up and take the my son to school. My daughter still doesn't go to school because she's very small. And then I think a Catholic journalist, and especially a journalist that covers Catholic Church, needs a lot of spiritual strength, because it's very challenging. Because then I mean, we believe that the church is holy, but then as a journalist that covers the Catholic Church, sometimes you feel it's not that holy. Of course, we think it's holy because of the supernatural, but then you're covering here the human aspect, which is not that holy many times, you know. But then it really challenges your faith, you know. Like sometimes you feel like God, I mean, Lord, I know the apostles, they weren't great sometimes, you know, but the people we have here sometimes, I mean, it's not that they're great, it's that some of them are completely evil. So what are we dealing with here, you know? But yeah, so then I usually go to mass in the morning. You know, I think that's what I want to say. Like, it's very important to for a Catholic journalist to have like a strong spiritual life, a good spiritual director, and a good community. You know, I'm thankful I have the three of those. Working especially on the strong spiritual life because you know with kids and the work is very difficult. But yeah, I try to go to daily mass and pray every morning for at least half an hour. If it's in front of the Blessed Sacrament, better. Pray my rosary, read my Bible, do spiritual reading too. So yeah, I think that's essential to have a strong spiritual life, you know. And then now in the more technical part, you know, usually, so you ask me if I do more today stuff or deeper research. It's a little bit of both, you know. But I would say I maybe write two or three short pieces a week, three or four, let's say, and then there's more deep stuff that I'm always researching, you know, keeping an eye on, etc. That just grows into a story step by step, you know. There are story. I mean, I'm not gonna name anything specifically. For example, there's a story now that I've been working on in parts every now and then for maybe 9 months, something like that. And maybe it'll never be published because I never get the sources good enough, you know, or maybe it will eventually. There are stories in which you work for a couple of weeks and then they come to nothing because you don't have good enough sources or because simply there's nothing there, you know, or nothing newsworthy. Um, so yeah, there's always a bit of everything. So I'd say my day usually in the morning I write a bit more, and then in the afternoon I usually go out to events, meet people, um, have lunches and dinners, and many espressos here and there. You know, with people with not necessarily with sources, but you need to start to get to know people. You know, and then these people they might not become sources, but they might lead you to other people who might do become. So yeah, there's a bit. I mean journalism is part of being a good writer, but it's also a very, very good part of being a good networker and doing PR for yourself, you know? Yeah.
I was going to ask if Rome is particularly a sort of a strong network town where it really is a matter of who you know and where you can go and get to who you can get to speak with you. Has that been your experience in the short time you've been there?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Uh, uh, and it's just because, in a way, it's the Italian way, you know? It's here you get a job because you know someone, not necessarily because you did a PhD on the subject, you know? Um, doesn't mean that they're going to hire anyone who knows someone, you know, you need some qualification, but it's easier if you have like a contact on the inside, let's say, you know? So I think that the church also has a bit of this ethos, you know, not necessarily talking with promotions, but they're gonna talk to you, be friendly with you. It's easier if someone else introduces you to someone, you know, it's kind of like that, you know, it's a bit of a more of the informal context that you do that with institutional things, you know, or institutional context that you might be able to do. So yeah, to some degree it's like that, yeah.
Yeah, that's always seemed to be a little bit more the Italian or the Mediterranean way than the Anglo-Saxon
And the
institutions.
Latin American
Just
way. So I mean, I don't
Mhm.
love it, but I'm perfectly comfortable in a world like that, you know, because it's what I'm used to from back home.
Let me ask you the question of the show, which is what kind of advice do you feel you could give now from your perspective in your career to students of philosophy, people who have that passion for philosophy that you described yourself as having,
Yeah.
maybe 8 or 10 years ago? What should they be doing now, and what sort of factors should they take into account when they're thinking about their future?
They should be reading and reading and reading, you know, like my greatest regret when I started political science philosophy. So basically the time between 15 when I started getting interested in more intellectual stuff and 24, which is the moment my eldest son was born. So that 9 year period was not reading more. because that's the period of time in my life in which I could have read three books. I mean, I'm not advocating for eating books, but I would have been able to read two or three books a week if I wanted to. There are books that need more digestion, but you get the point. I would have been able to read way more than I did. Um, and that's something I really regret. I have a good philosophical formation, but now I don't have time to take Kant's Critique of Reason and really get into it. Maybe I can read it, but really get into it, make footnotes, take some time to digest it, etc. I mean, I have two kids running around my house all day long, and I have a job, and then my main issue was that I was working while I studied. And there were many times in which I was just, playing video games or just going out way too much. And I didn't use that time to reading. I'm not saying you shouldn't play video games. I'm not saying you shouldn't go out with your friends, do it. But I would certainly take a couple of hours or 3 hours less of video games a week and maybe a couple of times out with my friends a month to read more, and maybe a couple of TV shows. So read a lot, and especially start with the great books, start with the classics. There are great books and classics for a reason. You don't have to love them, but you should have good reasons not to love them. And to have that great reasons, you have to read them, there are some of these great books that I've read and they don't really speak to me, but I did the job, I did the job. I went through them, I suffered them, and I can say why I don't like them or why they don't speak to me. So, and then especially because in this hyper specialized world, because now in philosophy we have hyper specialization, uh, you have philosophy of neuroscience, which is what I did my thesis in. Whereas 200 years ago, you had philosophy, you had ethics, and you had metaphysics. But you didn't have that many areas. Like now, there's philosophy of everything. Like I had a partner in my master's who did a thesis on philosophy of pregnancy, for example. So then, in this time of specialization, it's good to start with the fundamentals, to have a good base, read your Aquinas, read your Aristotle, read your Kant, um, before you actually start getting into a notion of specialized literature and papers and get lost in that. Because then you're just studying an ant instead of the whole woods, and that shouldn't be the case. And then my other advice would be don't discard philosophers that you think you're not going to agree with. I wouldn't say read them first, but don't discard them, Like I would never tell a 17-year-old to read Nietzsche, that's poison for a 17-year-old. But if you're a philosophy student, you already have a good base. Read Nietzsche, read Foucault, because it'll help you understand the world. It'll help you understand what people actually think. I must say I don't like Nietzsche, not even his style. But Foucault, I enjoyed reading Foucault a lot when I did my masters. Well, I've been reading Foucault since my political science bachelor's, but got really into Foucault during my masters. I found myself disagreeing with him 95% of the time, but I found him fascinating, the way he analyzes things and to understand the postmodern mentality, So that's also very good, People think reading Marx Capital is a waste of time. I don't think it's a waste. I haven't read Marx Capital, I'll be honest with you. But I think it's not a waste of time to actually get into these books and try to understand the other side and try to steel man them, Like, I mean, I had a natural distaste for Nietzsche, but until I read The Antichrist, I really couldn't say I understood where the distaste came from, And then the last advice would be, study philosophy for its own sake. So study it for the glory of God, and study it for what it is, love of wisdom. So don't study philosophy to get tenure or to get a PhD. because then, first of all, this is very difficult in this world. But then usually taking a disinterested approach to philosophy has better practical results, you know? I found that a lot of people who studied philosophy just because they liked it ended up being very well in life, you know, being very high positions in the corporate world, in journalism, in law, or in clergy, but then as a very well-formed clergy, you know? So it's actually taking a more disinterested approach, you know, it's to the study of philosophy is more effective into becoming a successful professional. But then I would give the advice my mom gave me, which is also learn a trade, you know, have something that can make money for you and then can make you have a family while you can dedicate yourself to the study of philosophy, even if it's just in your free time, you know, whether it is a blue collar trade or it's just translating or making websites or learning to code or whatever. Learn something practical that you enjoy that can help you build up a professional career, you know, for a few years, maybe not for the rest of your life, but at least for a few years. And that can give you the time to dedicate the leisure, you know, to enjoy the leisure by reading philosophy and by building up your spirit with philosophy, with good philosophy. Yeah.
That's fantastic advice. I appreciate that. That tracks with a lot of what I've heard and what I've even told my students. I've found in my limited experience with North American university students is that they generally underestimate the value and the uniqueness of their limited time at university. That many people will look back even a year or two later and say, I had all these resources at my disposal and I didn't use them as fully as I could. Thanks very much, Edgar. My guest for this episode has been Edgar Beltrán, who is the Rome correspondent for The Pillar. Thank you again for being on the show.
Thanks to you, Christopher. Anytime.
Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.